Okay, so let's continue on with, in this lecture, let's continue on with the Electoral College. And let's keep in mind that the electors, these are actually people, right? This isn't like a mathematical thing. These are people. And so the first thing I want to address is like, how are electors chosen? Like, who decides who the electors are going to be? Now, it actually turns out that there's like a variety of ways, because each in the Constitution gives each state the authority to conduct its elections. And so each state sets the rules for how electors are chosen. And so, for example, in 33 states, so as of 2021, and this could change over the next few years, 33 states select their electors at party conventions. What does that mean? Every year, and especially during election years, the Democrats within a state will get together and have a big convention where all the Democrats from the state meet. Republicans will do the same thing, and also all the other little parties that have no chance of winning do the same thing. But at the party conventions, people will essentially run to be electors, right? So somebody will want to be the elector for the Democratic candidate or for the Republican candidate, and they decide them at these conventions. In other places, that depending on the state, and this is true in Washington D.C., their state they don't have a whole convention. Each state has like a committee meeting of the head people in the party within that state, and the committees choose the electors. And so they just do it in different ways. In some states, the chairman of the party decides. In some cases, the governor decides. In some cases, the presidential nominee will decide. And so, for example, in the 2020 election, in every state and in Washington, D.C., there were electors for each candidate. So Donald Trump had electors for each state, and Joe Biden had electors for each state. And then depending on which one of those candidates won the particular state or Washington, D.C., then those electoral votes would be counted. That's the way it works. Now, people talk frequently about the fact that electors aren't required by law to vote for the person to whom they're pledged. In other words, if you're an elector for Donald Trump, and you wind up being selected, let's say you're an elector, your party had a convention in Alabama, you ran for and won a position as an elector. Donald Trump won Alabama. It may be that in certain states, electors don't have to vote for the person to whom they're pledged. With that, when you're pledged to vote for a candidate, that means that that's the person you were supposed to cast your vote for. But the thing to keep in mind is that the electors themselves are all very reliable, dedicated party members. And so even though there are instances of what we call faithless electors, people who wind up not voting for the candidate to whom they're pledged, and there's a lot of discussion about this, faithless electors have never affected the outcome of a presidential election at all. And so as much time is spent talking about faithless electors, their impact on our presidential elections has been zero. Now, I suppose it's possible that in a very close presidential election where the number of electors is one candidate gets 270 and one gets 268 or something like that, or if it's a tie, one faithless elector could have a big impact. But it doesn't seem very likely to happen, and there's probably good reason to allow people to switch their vote and not be locked into voting for whomever they're pledged to. So for example, suppose a presidential candidate won a particular state and then afterwards committed some sort of heinous crime that made it clear that the person wasn't suited to be president. It would be a good thing that electors weren't required to vote for that person. But again, the likelihood of something like this happening is extremely low. And so as much time as is spent on faithless electors is equal to the lack of impact that they've had on presidential elections. So after the election, what happens is the electors meet in their state capitals and they cast their ballots. So what the framers didn't want, they didn't want all of the electors getting together like in the national capital because they were afraid of shenanigans that might happen. I don't use the word shenanigans very often, but it fits in this particular case. So instead, they decided that the electors would stay in their state capitals, and that's where they would cast their ballots. Once they did that, the state legislatures themselves would certify the votes, make sure that the votes matched how the election went out and certify it, essentially put their stamp of approval on it. And then once they have that stamp of approval, they send, there's like 5 different copies or 6 different copies of the actual electoral votes. One of those copies gets sent to the United States Senate, and that's where the actual counting of the electoral votes happens. They literally take the electoral votes that were certified by the state legislatures and sent to the Senate, and they count those. Now, there are other copies of the electoral votes that go to the Secretary of State and different people, but when they're counting the electoral votes, that they're actually counting the ones certified by the state legislature. So that's the actual votes that are counted. So on January 6, 2021, when people invaded the Capitol building and got into the Senate, one of the things that didn't get very much discussion in the media was that a staff person who worked for the Senate parliamentarian, who is the person who ensures that the rules are followed all the time in the Senate, one of the staffers made a point of saying, let's grab the electoral ballots. Because if they hadn't grabbed those electoral ballots, and let's say the rioters had gotten in there and destroyed them or taken them, it really could have prolonged the process of certifying that Joe Biden won the election. But this person, under intense pressure, had the presence of mind to make sure that they grabbed those ballots and when they fled the Senate. So the electoral ballots are there and are counted in Congress in front of both the House and the Senate. The House and the Senate convene together and they approve the certified electoral votes. Now, this became a sort of topic of discussion at some point, and I want to be 100% clear on this. The way the Constitution lays it out, the role of the Vice President is to oversee or preside over the certification process. The Vice President doesn't get to reject or accept the ballots. The role of the Vice President is simply to preside over the counting of the ballots. So as January 6th was coming around in 2021, President Trump kept saying that Mike Pence had the ability to reject some ballots. And essentially what President Trump was trying to do was to get reject enough ballots that neither candidate would have 269 electoral votes. And then I'll tell you what would happen in a case where no presidential candidate has at least 270 electoral votes, because that's what you need in order to win a presidential election. You need 270 or more electoral votes. So in attempting to decertify or not accept those ballots, one, President Trump was asking Vice President Pence to do something that was not legal, not constitutional, and a violation of his oath. And in the next video, I'll play I'll play a video of a professor explaining exactly how this works. But that's the way it works. The Vice President, the Constitution says the Vice President shall count the ballots. He doesn't have any kind of authoritative role in determining what can and can't be accepted.